Consider for a moment the last 36 hours that Barack Obama has had as president of the United States. Just the last 36 hours.
Today, the government of Libya announced the death of Muammar Gaddafi. This marks the end of a long and painful chapter for the people of Libya, who now have the opportunity to determine their own destiny in a new and democratic Libya. Without putting a single U.S. service member on the ground, we achieved our objectives, and our NATO mission will soon come to an end. Today, I can report that, as promised, the rest of our troops in Iraq will come home by the end of the year. After nearly 9 years, America's war in Iraq will be over.
The successful toppling of one of the world's most brutal dictators and the formal end of a 9-year-long American war? In these last 36 hours, Barack Obama has presided over 2 events that would qualify as monumental in any presidency. And yet, even while racking up those 2 enormous accomplishments, there was something else that happened in the same 36-hour span that may ultimately matter more to the future of his presidency.
The Senate has rejected President Obama's streamlined jobs bill aimed at preventing layoffs of teachers and firefighters by local and state governments. This latest legislation was a slimmed-down remnant of the president's larger $450 billion jobs bill that was rejected last week.
Toppling Muammar Gaddafi and ending a war, no problem. Passing a jobs bill in the middle of a terrible, terrible continued economic recession, no shot. Last night, every single Republican in the Senate voted to filibuster the first part of President Obama's now piecemeal jobs plan. Every single Republican, along with 2 Democrats, voted against a bill that would allow state and local governments to hire or rehire and retrain school teachers, police officers, firefighters, and other first responders. Republicans blocked that bill from even being debated. And even though this is just a snapshot of the past 36 hours, this is sort of the story of the Obama presidency so far. Huge foreign policy achievements coupled with jaw-dropping frustrations on the domestic policy side. From essentially the moment Barack Obama took office, he's managed to rack up one foreign policy success after another. His first real test on the international stage actually came within his first 100 days in office. Remember, it was when he sent an order in for the U.S. Navy SEALs to free an American ship captain who had been taken hostage by Somali pirates. From there, it was a whole string of foreign policy achievements. Most notably, of course, the successful mission to hunt down and kill the head of al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, after 10 years on the run. More recently, there was the drone strike that took out the American-born cleric in Yemen. And President Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009 for the new vision of diplomacy that he offered from America. That new face to the world included amazing and sometimes highly effective relief efforts on the part of the United States in places like Haiti and Japan, as well as Pakistan. President Obama's administration has skillfully maneuvered through the Arab Spring in the Middle East that brought down regimes in Tunisia, Egypt, and now finally the NATO mission, initially led by the U.S., that toppled Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Now, whatever side you're on here, whether you're a Democrat or the few Republicans watching, there really isn't any denying that these are real, concrete foreign policy achievements, many of them coming in just the last year. And yet in that same time period, President Obama has seen his domestic policy agenda stall to the point where it's considered an achievement just to keep the lights on in Washington. We are now heading into an election year, and this president is facing a real dichotomy, a dichotomy made most clear by the Libya-Iraq news this week versus the jobs bill news. Now, most political analysts and scholars maintain that foreign policy successes don't make much of a difference on an election about the economy. But maybe there is something useful in demonstrating how obstructionist Republicans have been by holding them up against a president who has clearly had leadership capacity, skills, and successes in this other arena. Given the current political reality, is there anything that this president can get done domestically? Is there any way to govern in the American political system to bring back our economy, create jobs, generate new opportunities for education? Can we do any of this without Congress and the president actually working together? Now, Barack Obama campaigned for office by saying that the problem of partisanship was destroying our country. His tenure in office has been an object lesson in exactly that. the problem of partisanship grinding progress to a halt. Now, what can be done to change that? Joining us to think through that question is Chris Hayes, the host of MSNBC's new show, Up with Chris Hayes, that I spent some time on last weekend. It was great. And this is my payback. You got me up early, and so I'm keeping you up late.
I'm happy. I'm overjoyed to be here. And I love being introduced as joining us now to think through that question.
Yes.
That's what I want to do on TV, is think through things.
Well, because this is legitimately a question, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I could just sort of rail about how this is all the Republicans' fault, and so, we just have to put Obama back in there with the Democratic Congress. That's fine, but we've got a year.
Right.
We're a year out. Is it possible to govern domestically right now?
I think the short answer is no. And I think the even more disturbing answer is that as you were reading the intro, what occurred to me is that this is a perfect example of the ways in which legislative dysfunction cultivate the authoritarian impulse in American life. And the reason is that we can point to all these things the president has done in the seat of imperial power that is the executive, with essentially no congressional oversight, because he can do that thing. He can order Anwar al-Awlaki is killed by a drone strike. He can send Navy SEALs around these places. He sits in the throne of imperial executive power. As soon as he moves into the domestic sphere, he has to deal with the Senate and the dysfunctional body of the filibuster. And so what he does is it produces a desire in the populace to bypass Congress, which is deeply unhealthy.
That's right.
Deeply sick and unhealthy in terms of how we think about it. And I think the other thing to think about is that bill failed, the stripped-down bill failed 50-50, right?
Right.
In the absence of the filibuster, Joe Biden shows up on Capitol Hill, he casts a deciding vote, and is passed. So the way that the filibuster has been institutionalized is a huge part of the kind of cancer that's growing on our legislative body.
Sure, but it's true that the Democrats then turned around and filibustered this Republican bill the next hour, and we were, less likely to feel angst about it. I mean, this is part of what's going on, is these kind of rules of the game. But let me ask you about the rules of the game, because I hear you. I also feel anxiety about this idea of let's concentrate power. It's exactly what we were upset about, for example, in the context of the war that we are finally ending. But there have been moments in a context of divided government where we have been able to govern. And it's largely been because the president could use the bully pulpit, go to the population, get the backing of the public, and then pressure Congress. Why is this Congress so insulated from public opinion?
I think they have produced a level of caucus discipline that is essentially unprecedented in modern times. And I think political scientists, such as yourself, have shown that. I mean, have done the sort of analysis to show that the level of party line voting and caucus unity is unprecedented. We've moved toward this sort of parliamentary system. Right. The other thing I think is really important to think about is the difference between rules and norms and how they guide a legislative body.
Yeah.
The rules say one thing, the norms say the other. There's a body of things that just aren't done that can be as powerful in the force of prohibition as a rule that says it hasn't been done. And one of the things the Republicans have been entrepreneurs in, incredibly pioneering, is breaking those norms. Things that just weren't done, they just do, and they say, what's up? What are you going to do? Tom DeLay, we saw this with redistricting. This is the iconic example of this. No one wrote a rule saying you can't redistrict mid-election. It was just the norm. The Commerce Secretary, who was finally, Bryson, who was finally approved on Friday, passed by 45 votes. Took 5 months. There was no reason, except for the fact that Republicans said, we want you to sign these trade deals first. So what we have seen is they have exploited the space between the norms and the rules to create this kind of obstruction dysfunction.
Right. So we're in a place where we've got obstruction, we've got dysfunction. It was not always this way, but we can't just yearn for the authoritarian. We can't just yearn for the dictator. That's also not going to get us in the long term where we want to go.
No, I mean, I think what we need actual reforms. I mean, I think what happens when a space opens up between the norms and the rules, as they have in the United States Senate particularly, you need to reform the rules because the two of them fundamentally have to reflect each other. And I think that's really the issue. And it's a hard, and Rachel, God knows, has talked about the filibuster. We've talked about the filibuster. You talked about the filibuster. Tough. It's a hard thing to sell, but like at the end of the day, that dysfunction begins to be this cancer that spreads through the entire democracy.
Chris Hayes from MSNBC, from my favorite magazine, The Nation.
Yes.
Make sure that you watch Up with Chris Hayes this weekend, and thanks for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it.